In the winter of 87 BC, the ancient city of Athens faced a sight it had not seen in generations: Roman siege engines assembling beyond its walls. For months, the people inside watched their food supplies dwindle, their water sources cut off, their sacred groves reduced to timber for battering rams. What followed would become one of the most devastating episodes in classical history, not just a military conquest, but a systematic campaign of retribution that would reshape the Eastern Mediterranean for generations. To understand what happened in Athens and across the Pontic territories between 87 and 83 BC, we need to go back 5 years earlier to an event that shocked the Roman world to its core. In 88 BC, Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, orchestrated what became known as the Asiatic Vespers. According to ancient sources, including the historians Appian and Plutarch, approximately 80,000 Roman and Italian residents across Asia Minor were killed in a single, coordinated action. The massacres swept through cities like Ephesus, Pergamon, and Adramyttium. Men, women, and children, merchants, tax collectors, settlers were hunted down in their homes and even inside temples, where they had sought sanctuary. The scale was unprecedented. Entire Roman communities disappeared overnight. The message was clear. Mithridates was declaring total war not just on Rome's legions, but on Rome's very presence in the East. Rome's response would be equally total. But Rome in 88 BC was not the stable superpower of popular imagination. The Republic was fracturing from within. Political rivals battled for control. Ambitious generals commanded armies more loyal to them than to the state. Into this volatile moment stepped Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician general born into a declining noble family who had risen through ruthless competence and political calculation. Sulla had already proven himself in Africa and during Rome's brutal social war against its Italian allies. He understood violence not as chaos, but as a tool, something that could be organized, directed, and used to achieve strategic goals. When he received command of the Eastern campaign, he saw more than a military assignment. He saw opportunity. But before he could march east, Sulla's political enemies in Rome, led by Gaius Marius, stripped him of his command. Sulla's response shocked the Roman world. He marched his legions on Rome itself, an act considered sacrilege, a violation of centuries of tradition. He reclaimed his authority by force, then turned his armies eastward. By 87 BC, Sulla landed in Greece with approximately 30,000 men. Waiting for him were Pontic proxy forces numbering over 100,000. Commanded by Archelaus, a skilled admiral turned general. Several Greek cities had allied with Mithridates, seeing him as a liberator from Roman taxation and exploitation. Among these was Athens, ruled by the tyrant Ariston, who had openly celebrated Roman deaths. Sulla's siege of Athens was methodical and merciless. His engineers diverted rivers, constructed massive siege towers, and slowly strangled the city's supply lines. Inside, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Ancient sources describe citizens eating grass and boiling leather. Yet Ariston, safe in his fortified palace, refused to surrender. The breakthrough came in March of 86 BC. Roman forces breached the walls near the Piraeus Gate. What followed was not simply the capture of a rebellious city, it was a demonstration of what Roman discipline could achieve when unleashed. Plutarch, writing a century later but drawing on contemporary sources, describes soldiers flooding through the streets. Sulla reportedly ordered his men to kill indiscriminately at first, then stopped the massacre at specific points enough to terrorize, but not so much as to make the city worthless. Bodies filled the streets. Blood ran so heavily, according to Plutarch, that it flowed out the city gates into the surrounding fields. Among the targeted groups were those associated with the Pontic alliance officials, military personnel, and members of the royal household and temple establishments that had supported Mithridates. Ancient sources suggest that thousands of non-combatants, including women connected to Pontic religious and administrative institutions, were either killed or enslaved during this phase and the broader campaign. The exact numbers are debated among historians. Some ancient sources suggest between 6,000 and 10,000. Women from royal and noble households across the region were captured or enslaved during Sulla's Eastern campaign. Modern scholars caution that ancient casualty figures are often inflated or imprecise, but archaeological evidence confirms the scale of destruction was massive. What is historically certain is this: Sulla's campaign was not simply about military victory. It was about sending a message, one written in destruction, enslavement, and economic devastation. And Athens was only the beginning. After Athens fell, Sulla did not rest. His legions moved north, pursuing Archelaus and the remaining Pontic forces across central Greece. Two major battles would decide the campaign's outcome. At Chaeronea in 86 BC, Sulla faced an army that outnumbered his forces nearly 3-1. Archelaus deployed scythed chariots, heavy cavalry, and dense infantry formations, classic Hellenistic warfare at its peak. But Sulla had transformed his legions into something different, a flexible, adaptive fighting machine that could respond to changing battlefield conditions. Using terrain to his advantage, Sulla positioned his forces on high ground and concealed reserves behind hills. When the Pontic center pushed forward, Roman cohorts struck from the flanks. The result was catastrophic for Mithridates' forces. Ancient sources describe marshes clogged with bodies, armor glinting beneath dark water. The following year, at Orchomenus, Sulla forced a final confrontation on terrain that favored his disciplined infantry over Pontic cavalry. Again, the Pontic forces broke. Thousands fled into surrounding swamps and drowned under the weight of their armor. Archaeological surveys in the 20th century recovered arrowheads, armor fragments, and human remains from these marshes, physical evidence that corroborates the ancient accounts. With Greece secured, Sulla turned his attention to Asia Minor itself. But by 84 BC, political pressures were mounting. Back in Rome, his enemies were regaining power. Sulla needed to return west. Darkness, he negotiated a settlement with Mithridates. The king would surrender conquered territories, pay massive indemnities, and hand over hostages. But even as treaties were signed, punishment continued across the region. Cities that had supported Mithridates faced crushing fines. Roman soldiers were quartered in private homes. Communities were stripped of wealth accumulated over generations. Temple treasuries were emptied and melted down to fund Rome's ongoing civil wars. The human cost extended far beyond battlefield casualties. According to sources like Appian and Plutarch, thousands of people, particularly women from noble and royal households who symbolized Pontic power and alliance, were enslaved or subjected to violence as part of Rome's punitive occupation. These weren't random acts but systematic reprisals targeting those associated with resistance to Roman authority. Modern historians view these events through multiple lenses. Some see calculated state terrorism, violence used deliberately to break political will and deter future resistance. Others emphasize economic exploitation. Sulla's campaign funded itself through plunder, and enslaved populations became commodities in Rome's vast labor system. What's clear from both ancient texts and archaeological evidence is that the destruction was real and lasting. Excavations at Athens' Keramikos uncovered mass graves with remains showing sword trauma consistent with ancient descriptions of the sack. Charred timber from buildings destroyed by Sulla's forces has been carbon dated to this exact period. At Orchomenus, the landscape itself preserves memory armor and weapons still embedded in marsh soil where men died fleeing Roman legions. In Pontus itself, archaeological sites show disruption layers from this period, hoards of coins and jewelry buried in haste and never recovered, suggesting sudden displacement of populations. The consequences rippled forward through history. Sulla returned to Italy in 83 BC and plunged Rome into civil war. He became dictator, posted proscription lists of enemies to be killed, and executed thousands. He proved that marching on Rome worked, that terror could be legalized, that violence could be framed as necessary reform. Young men like Julius Caesar watched and learned. The Roman Republic never recovered from the precedents Sulla established. Meanwhile, Mithridates did not forget. He rebuilt his forces and launched 2 more wars against Rome over the following decades. The grievances Sulla's occupation created became fuel for continued resistance. Violence had not brought stability, it had guaranteed future conflict. Today, historians study the Mithridatic Wars and Sulla's campaigns as case studies in how empires use force, how occupation creates cycles of retaliation, and how decisions made in the name of security can undermine the very stability they claim to protect. The archaeological record mass graves in Athens, weapons in Greek marshes, hastily buried treasures in Asia Minor tells a story that transcends the specific politics of 83 BC. It speaks to broader patterns. How states justify collective punishment, how civilians become targets when viewed as extensions of enemy power, how trauma embeds itself in collective memory. The women and families caught in Sulla's campaign were not abstract casualties. They were people with names, histories, and communities most lost to us now, but preserved in fragments. A seal with a royal inscription, jewelry that was meant to be retrieved but never was, bones marked by violence and buried in haste. Their stories matter not because they are unique in histories. Sadly, they are not, but because they remind us that behind every imperial campaign, every necessary act of retribution, lie individual human consequences that outlast the politics of the moment. Sulla died in 78 BC, celebrated by his supporters, despised by his enemies. The systems he built, the loyalty networks, the use of terror as policy, the precedent of military power superseding civilian authority, outlived him and helped destroy the republic he claimed to defend. The question ancient historians posed still resonates. Can stability be built on violence? Or does violence simply create the conditions for more violence? In an endless cycle, the ruins of Athens, the marshes of Orchomenus, and the abandoned treasures of Pontus suggest an answer that echoes across centuries.